Sewing a bound buttonhole takes an immense amount of diligence and careful construction. So please take your time while working on this. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pattern pieces, and as you can read, they are cut from various fabrics. Make sure you're following the cutting instructions for these. The buttonholes, as they are drafted on the patterns, are designed to fit a 1-inch button. So you will need a button with 1 inch of diameter or 7/8 of an inch diameter. I've got clear buttons, so it makes it a little bit easier for you to see them on the sample, especially when it comes to sewing the buttons. I went with clear buttons so that you could see how I'm sewing them, but you'll see this one is about 1 inch wide, inch in diameter. So you'll need 2 of these because we've got 2 buttonholes, 1 and 2. So let's take a look at each one of these patterns. We've got the bound buttonhole right garment pattern, cut 1 from muslin. Make sure to, I'm going to hold on to this pattern because we're going to end up using the tailor's tacks later. But I am going to clip my notches and mark my seam allowance. You can use chalk, transfer paper, friction pen, whatever you prefer. You can hold on to the pattern. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can use your ruler to measure the seam allowance on that. I'm just going to set this aside for right now. I'm going to keep everything pinned, however. Here is the bound buttonhole right facing pattern. Cut 1 from muslin, cut 1 from interfacing. You'll notice I have my muslin layer under here, and underneath that is my interfacing. I'm choosing black weft interfacing for demonstration purposes. If you look closely, well, you probably can't see it, but this side is my bumpy fusible side. This is the side that has the adhesive on it. This side does not have adhesive. So I've cut this in such a way that the adhesive side is ready to automatically be fused to the wrong side of my muslin. So that is ready to go. I'm gonna fuse this first in just a moment, but I'm gonna set this aside for right now. The bound buttonhole left garment pattern, cut 1 from muslin. So this is cut and ready. Same thing here. I'm gonna clip my notches and transfer my seam allowance. Mark, I think I've done that. Yeah, I have that on there. 1/2 inch seam allowance. I've transferred in chalk right there. I'm gonna set this aside as well. The left facing pattern, bound buttonhole left facing pattern, cut 1 from muslin, cut 1 from interfacing. Same story as what I did with the right facing pattern. There's my muslin, there's my weft interfacing with the bumpy fusible side ready to be fused to the wrong side of my fabric. The bound buttonhole interfacing pattern, teeny little square, cut 2 of these out of interfacing. So I've got 2 cut from interfacing, set those aside for right now. The bound buttonhole pattern, 2 out of contrast fabric and cut 2 of interfacing. So I've got 2 cut from my contrast bandana fabric and 2 copies cut from interfacing. First thing I'm gonna do is head to the iron and start placing all of my interfacing. So I'm gonna grab my bound buttonhole pattern, my bound buttonhole left facing, my bound buttonhole right facing, and I'm going to grab my bound buttonhole interfacing and my bound buttonhole left garment pattern. This is the one with the little squares on it. I'm going to head to the iron. I'm going to start with the easy ones, the bound buttonhole pattern. These are just the squares cut on bias. Remember to cut these on bias. There we go, bound buttonhole pattern. I'm going to unpin those. Each of these contrast squares, wrong side up, will get a square of interfacing fused to the wrong side. Remember to just place your iron, give it some steam, let it sit. Raise it up, let it cool. these cool off a little bit. Check the edges, make sure it's not lifting. Okay, those are ready to go. Don't need that pattern anymore. For our bound buttonhole left facing piece, this has a solid piece of interfacing on the back. Your facings will usually get interfacing. I'm going to carefully remove my pins, try to keep everything aligned. And interface, add the interfacing to the wrong side of this muslin. Let it cool. If there's any bubbles or lifting, it's looking okay. And I'm going to reaffix my pattern because I've not yet clipped my notches. Sometimes when you cut the notches from your fabric and you add fusible interfacing, the fusible interfacing can kind of close those notches up again. It can be hard to find them when you clip them onto your fabric preemptively. So I'm just going to repin it, and I'll clip through this on the work table through both layers now that I have the interfacing attached. All right, bound buttonhole, right garment interfacing, sorry. There we go, bound buttonhole, right facing pattern. I'm going to do the same thing with this. Unpin it, flip it over, fuse my interfacing, and then I'll repin my pattern so I can cut my notches. Okay. Do my best to line this back up with my fabric. And set that back on the work table. The last one is our bound buttonhole left garment pattern. There we go. This is our last pattern, the left garment pattern. This will get these tiny little bound buttonhole interfacing pieces. These two tiny little squares are going to go onto our bound buttonhole garment pattern. Remember, this is the one that's got these little shapes on it. We want to add these little squares of interfacing behind these little shapes. So I have to kind of eyeball where this buttonhole is going to go and where this one's going to go. And our little squares are just large enough to kind of cover those up. Doesn't have to be perfect, but we want to get as close as possible. I'm going to use some pins to poke through my pattern just so I know where some of the corners are. Going down from one corner, coming out the other corner. I'm going to do the same down here. Again, just pinning through one corner, coming out the other corner, opposite corner. Oops. Just so I can see where that square is, so when I flip this over I have an idea of the orientation, and I can place my piece of interfacing just behind that just to cover it. I'm just going to do really quick. I'm not going to press it down really hard with my iron. I'm just going to hit it with the tip of my iron really carefully right there. So I just push the tip of my iron there so it's got a little bit of fusing. Let me try that one more time. Just the tip of the iron. Hold it for a couple of seconds. Let it cool. And now that little section is fused onto it. That's called iron pinning with fusible. You can just use the tip of your iron just to fuse a little section of it so it doesn't wiggle around on you. So that's set. I can take these pins out. And I'll do the same thing with this buttonhole up here. Just use my pins to kind of figure out where the placement is, and in and out through either corner. There we go. Flip this over so now I can kind of see where it is, and I'll place my little square of interfacing just to cover it. Again, this doesn't have to be perfect, just so long as it covers that area, and I'll just use the tip of my iron, press it down for about 3 or 4 seconds. Let it cool, and now that interfacing should be pinned there just for temporary purposes, so I can take my pins back out. I can remove these, but hold on to the pattern because we're going to use it later. I can flip this over, and now I can properly fuse these 2 squares into place. We can get rid of this little pattern, unless you want to use it for future use. You are welcome to reuse all these patterns. Hold on to them, keep them, save them for future projects. Okay, so that's got 2 squares of interfacing placed roughly where those 2 symbols are on our pattern. Okay, so back at the work table. The right garment pattern and the right facing patterns, we can set these aside for right now. This is where we're going to attach our button. But our buttonholes are going to take a considerable amount of time to do. So I'm not going to worry about the buttons right now. Let's focus on the buttonholes. So I'm using the left garment pattern that's got the 2 squares of interfacing on it. The left facing pattern that's got the whole thing interfaced. And my 2 bound buttonhole pieces made of contrast fabric with fusible interfacing on the back. For my left facing pattern, I've reaffixed my pattern so I can go ahead and clip my notches through everything. So I'm going to do that. Just get my notches clipped in there through my fabric and interfacing all at once. And I'll mark where my seam allowance is. I know it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to use chalk. I have some wax-based chalk here that hopefully will be visible against my black interfacing. There we go. And there's my stitching line, just so I don't lose it. I'll keep this, just keep 1 pin in here for later use because we'll kind of come back to that after we install our buttonholes. Now I want to focus on this left garment pattern. This one's going to be tricky. This is where we're going to install our bound buttonholes. And I'm going to go over the installation of this one down here. It's a little bit larger, a little bit easier to see. I'll do this one on video as well, but I'm not going to talk my way through this one. So pay close attention to how I go about installing this. I'm going to remove my pattern just for the moment. I'm just going to set it aside. But I want to make note of where I've placed my pieces of weft interfacing, and I kind of want to make note of where I've got my pieces on my pattern so I know where this square is roughly on my pattern. I'm going to grab one of my bound buttonhole pieces cut from contrast fabric with the interfacing on it, and I want to place this on top of my garment pattern. So my garment in this sample is made from muslin. This is the wrong side of it because I have my weft interfacing on it. And I want to place the right side of my contrast fabric down. So this is now right sides together. So my fabric is right sides together. I want to place it, it's not exactly center on my garment, but I want to leave this edge of my garment visible so I can overlay my pattern again and get an idea of where that lines up along this raw edge of my fabric. So this looks like a good place. It looks like if I place this here, I'll be pretty close. I'm going to raise it just a smidge. Trying to center it on this area. It does not have to be perfect. We've cut a large enough piece of fabric just for this reason, so that we're just kind of eyeballing where it goes. I'm going to pin this in place, pin through all the layers. And I'm going to hand baste. I'm going to grab some thread, needle and thread. Single thickness is fine. And I'm going to hand baste this fabric into place. Again, I want to get an idea of where my buttonhole is going to go, because I want to stitch somewhere outside of this space. So I'm just kind of guessing at where it's going to go. But I want to give myself ample space so I don't accidentally overlap where this buttonhole is going to go. This is a really quick basting stitch. Nice wide stitches. It's just to hold it in place so the pins don't get in our way. Okay. So that's just basted in place. And I can see this is my interfacing from the wrong side of my garment. And it looks like we've got enough clearance around here, so that's cool. I'm going to lay my pattern on top again, pin it in place. Now you can utilize your ruler to measure the placement for where this buttonhole is. I'm going to use some tailor's tacks. I'm going to tack through all of the layers. And these will be quick tailor's tacks. I'm just going to take single stitches. I'm not going to loop and loop over again because I'm not transferring these marks to more than one piece of. I'll take relatively large tailor's tacks, but I want to put my needle out through those corners so I know exactly where those corners are. So I'm just identifying, I'm putting my needle in about 1/8 of an inch in, and then I'm coming back out right on that corner as best I can. So I really want to identify where those corners are specifically. Turn my work around, get those out of the way. And again, going down and then bringing my needle up right on that corner. So I know I have a note to myself that when I peel this off, look for these outer points on my tailor's tacks. Okay. Gonna take out my pins and carefully peel this away, keeping my tailor's tacks in my fabric. Don't want to lose those points. Okay. So now I have some idea of where these individual corners are. You can see where this tailor tack came out, and this one down here, this one over here, and this one down here. So I'm going to use those to my advantage. I'm going to use my tailor's chalk. I have some wax-based tailor's chalk here. I'm going to connect those points, the outer edges of my tailor's tacks. Okay. Now these, what we're essentially making is a very small welt pocket. So these are going to be individual welts, and they are a half inch tall. Each is a half inch tall, making the total height of this rectangle 1 inch. You can see there's the raw edge, there's the edge of my ruler, there's the 1 inch mark. We're using 1 inch wide buttons, and my buttonhole is 1 1/8 inch wide. So the width of your buttonholes is always dictated by the width of your buttons. If you have a 1/2 inch wide button, your buttonhole would be 5/8 of an inch wide. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/8. That's 1/2 inch for the diameter of your button, plus an extra 1/8 of an inch. The extra 1/8 of an inch makes space for the threads that we're going to use to attach the button to the garment. So we're using 1 inch wide buttons. So my buttonhole is 1 plus 1/8 of an inch wide. So I'm going to use these measurements to help ensure that this rectangle is somewhere close to the correct measurements. It's a little bit skinny that way. It's looking good width-wise. I think I just need to widen it out a little bit. Yeah. There we go. It was looking a little bit askew. So this is my correct line out here. But again, this is all practice. Okay. Our fabric is hand basted in place. We've marked where our square is going to go. I'm actually going to remove my tailor's tacks because they bother me. I just needed to transfer those marks. I know where that square is now, that rectangle is, and I've marked it, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to go to my sewing machine. I'm going to sew this rectangle. I'm going to sew through all the layers, and I'm going to sew around this rectangle. When I go to do this, however, it's very important. I'm going to be using a number 1 stitch when I go to sew this for a few reasons. The number 1 stitch gives me much more control as I get into these corners rather than a number 2 stitch. A number 1 stitch is more secure. We're going to end up cutting through a lot of this, and a number 1 stitch helps to reinforce these corners because it's harder for the fabric to tear through a number 1 stitch. So it's a smaller stitch length. Your machine's going to seem to run a little bit slower. You'll have a little bit more dexterity, a little more control over your stitching as you work on a number 1 stitch. What's very important, however, when you go to sew these little rectangles, do not start in any of the corners. Start in the middle of one of the sides, preferably one of the longer sides. So I'm going to start in the middle here. I'm going to stitch and pivot in this corner, go down this line and pivot again. Over here, pivot again. Up to here, where I'll pivot one more time, and then I will overlap my stitches. No back tacking, just overlapping where I left off on a number 1 stitch. Okay, starting at that top edge. I want to have my ruler handy in case I need to check the measurements on this, and I'm going to stitch all the way to this corner and pivot. One more stitch. There we go. Pivot again. Trim these threads before they get out of hand. And as I come back through here, I'm going to find my original line of stitching and overlap. those threads. And I'm going to head to the iron to iron off my chalk marks. There is my little rectangle sewn through all the layers. There we go. 1 inch tall, 1 1/8 inch wide. Now I want to copy the shape that I've created in here because I'm going to need some of these marks to help me with the next step. This mark down the horizontal orientation of the buttonhole, you can see 1/2 inch in from either side, so it's halfway between. It's a 1 inch tall buttonhole, so I'm going to measure 1/2 inch, 1, 2, 3, 4 squares. Place my chalk mark in there, halfway, and each of these little triangles on either side, I believe, are 1/4 inch in from either side. Okay, so I'll measure 1/4 inch in on either side, make a little mark for myself. 2 squares, little mark, and then I want to draw from those marks into my corners. There we go. Close enough. Now, here comes the scary part. When you're working with any kind of welt pockets or bound buttonholes or anything like this, we now need to cut through everything. So when you make a welt pocket or you make a bound buttonhole, you are cutting through your garment. You are literally cutting a hole into your garment. So you need to commit to where it's going. You need to be confident in yourself and the work that you're getting ready to do, because there's no turning back. I want to cut along this middle line. I'm going to fold my fabric. I'm folding everything. I've got everything folded, and I'm going to snip right along that line as best as I can get it, as close as I can get it. Doesn't have to be perfect. And I'll unfold this, and now I've got a hole, and the hole goes through all the layers. But now it's giving me a pilot hole, so I can put my scissors in here, get the tip of my scissors in there, and I'll cut along this horizontal line in either direction until I reach that little point that I made 1/4 inch in on either side. Do the same thing over here, get to that little point there. All right, so I've just made the hole even bigger, and it's going to get bigger yet. This is where it gets precarious. From these points that I marked out of chalk, I have to clip into each corner. Do not clip through your stitching. Do not clip through your stitching. We went through all the trouble of marking where this little rectangle goes. We don't want to lose the stitching that we just made. Do not clip through your stitching. You want to snip until you're about 1/16 of an inch away from your stitching. You might be able to see. Let me see if I zoom out a little bit. So I'm going to clip until the tip of my needle, my scissors, is about 1/16 of an inch away from that corner. I don't want to get any closer than that. So I'll show you one corner here. I'm going to snip, and that is about as close as I'm going to get. I'm not going to get any closer than that. Take a nice snip through there. It's another reason we chose a number 1 stitch. Again, there's tiny stitches. It's harder for the fabric to tear through. This is also why we've interfaced everything. The interfacing acts as a stabilizer because we got to clip into this. Cut into this corner. Again, not getting any closer than about that. That's about as close as I am comfortable getting with my scissors. Same thing in this corner. Gonna get to... Okay. Sorry about that. Just had to change out batteries. Here we go. It's about as close as I want to get into any of these corners. And I'll go into the last one here. Stopping right about there. Don't want to get any closer than that. Do not clip through your stitches or you'll end up with a hole that you will not be able to repair. Okay. So now we've got a bunch of open fabric, big old hole in our garment. Now what do? We want to pull everything. Right now everything's right sides together, right? Right side of the fabric, right side of our garment. I'm going to remove my basting stitches because I don't need those anymore. Those held in place very well. So I'm going to pick those out. Okay, basting stitches are gone. And I want to take my contrast fabric, my bound buttonhole fabric, fold it in on itself, and shove it through that hole I just made. There we go. And it's making a little window for us. I'll show you that one more time. I'm going to take our garment fabric, kind of gather it up on itself. I'm sorry, our buttonhole fabric, contrast fabric. Push it through that hole until it makes a little window for us. Yep. I'm going to head to the ironing board and I want to press out. Here's my seam allowance from both my garment and my contrast fabric. I'm going to press all of these corners out till it's nice and flat as I can get it. I want this window to be nice and crisp, and I'm going to push all the seam allowance up and out of the way. You should see little trapezoidal pieces down here at the bottom and at the top, trapezoidal pieces of the seam allowance, and you should find those little triangles that we marked over here on your sides. The right and left side should have little triangular pieces of seam allowance on either side here. So I'm going to go to the iron. I want to make sure these are pressed out as neatly as possible. Get this window to open up as wide as it can. If you are finding you're getting extreme wrinkles and puckering in the corners, this is okay right down here. But if it's getting really, really bad, the wrinkles are looking very dramatic, it means you didn't clip far enough and you'll have to push everything back out to the right side of the fabric and you'll have to clip further into those corners. So it's a very tricky kind of dance between clipping enough to get a nice clean little window, but not clipping so much that you cut through your stitching. All right, I'm going to try to press this as nice and flat as I can. I'm going to be tugging on my fabric underneath here. Just to get this as nice and flat as possible. Try to work from one edge to the other. Just turn this around so we can get this other one nice and smooth. You're never going to be able to get the buttonhole fabric to lay perfect. It's never going to hide itself completely out of this window, but we just don't want it billowing up too much. Okay. I think that's about as good as I'm going to get that for right now. Do make sure when you press this, make sure that your seam allowances are visible. You should be able to see them sticking up and out in all four directions. That'll keep it nice and flat. From here, we want to start creating our buttonhole welts. To do that, I'm going to go to the wrong side of my fabric. I'm going to turn, here's the top of my sample. We're working from the top and the bottom of the piece. So I'm taking this top section of my fabric. I'm going to lay this down flat, give it a quick press. No steam, just kind of a quick little press there. And if I look at the front side, you can see suddenly my window is covered. I just turned that extra fabric down and I've covered my window. I'm going to take this same fabric that I just kind of pressed down. I'm going to fold it back up on itself. And I'm going to do my best to kind of align the raw edge with the raw edge of my seam allowance hanging out up there. I'm just going to turn this around to the opposite side, and now suddenly half of my window is covered. And there's that 1/2 inch that we had marked on our original pattern. There's that 1/2 inch welt. So now we've got half of our buttonhole in place. I'm going to press this. Actually, I'm just going to hold this in place for right now. I'll pin it temporarily, because I'm going to do the same thing with this bottom half. I'm going to push the bottom half up, give it a quick little press, just right along that edge. And then I'm going to fold it back on itself. And what we should see from the front side is our two welts just meeting each other. Oops, our two welts just meeting each other in the middle. This is what's called, we call this kissing, or welts are kissing. They should be right up against each other. There shouldn't be any gap in between them. You shouldn't really be able to see any light or anything through them. There we go. So mine are not quite kissing. There's a little bit of fabric, a little bit of a gap between them. I'm going to remove my pin from the back because sometimes it's a little bit easier to manipulate each of them. You want to make sure that they are horizontal. We don't want them tilting, like we don't want one to be way up here, you know, down here and way up here. We don't want them crooked. We want to keep them nice and horizontal, and we want the two to kiss as best we can get them. So they should be about equal depth. And I'm going to press this into place once I'm satisfied. This is another reason why we give ourselves an ample amount of fabric to create these buttonholes, because then we've got a lot of wiggle room to work with. And our fabric is this big. Okay, pretty happy with that. So I'm going to make sure that's nice and pressed so it doesn't go anywhere. So this is the state of our bound buttonhole so far. Just to recap, we placed the piece of contrast fabric face down. We marked out where our bound buttonhole was going to go. Well, I'm sorry, we placed this contrast fabric face down, pinned it, and then hand basted it in place, marked where our bound buttonhole was going to go, stitched around that marking with a number 1 stitch, starting from one of the long sides, pivoting in all the corners and overlapping our stitches. Then we found the center, the horizontal center of that rectangle, and then marked into each of the 4 corners, and then cut along that center and cut up into each of the 4 corners. Pushed all of our contrast fabric to the wrong side of our garment. Then I pressed this top edge down and folded it back on itself to produce our top welt. Pressed this bottom portion up and then back on itself to form the bottom welt, the bottom lip of our bound buttonhole. Now I'm going to finish this off by doing a little bit of stitching. And again, you can alter the fold of these 2 pieces. You can see this is no longer It doesn't look good from this side, but everything's going to get covered over, so I'm not worried about that. But from this side, what I want to do from the right side is I want to lift up my garment fabric, and underneath you should find those little triangles sitting on the sides. So here on the right hand side, here's this little triangle, and here's all my extra fabric from what I just folded. And I'm going to top stitch right along this edge so I can catch my seam allowances, catch all my folded fabric. I'm going to stitch through everything. I'm just going to get this out of the way. I don't want to catch anything along this edge, but just along here, I'm going to stitch through that on my machine. To make sure that I'm stitching close enough, however, I'm definitely going to need one of my finishing feet. So here are my 2 finishing feet. If I use this foot and I'm stitching in this orientation, I am not going to get close enough. I'm going to be stitching way out over here. I might catch a little bit of it, but I need to use this foot if I'm going to be stitching in this orientation. This way I can get right up against that edge and stitch that right into place. I'll do the same thing over here on the other side where my other remaining seam allowance is and the rest of the folded bound buttonholes. And to save me from having to switch from this foot to this foot on my machine, I'm just going to turn the work around and stitch down this side as well. So we're going to top stitch through all those layers and finish this off. I've changed the foot on my machine. I'm going to make sure that I'm stitching in a number 2 stitch. I'll make sure that these 2 welts are kissing. I'm going to hold this as steady as I can. Back tack at the beginning, back tack at the end. I can feel my fabric wanting to shift on me. Make sure it hasn't shifted too much. You may need to be a little heavy-handed, pin it in place or hand baste it in place to make sure that these welts don't slide apart while you're stitching. I'm going to do the same on the opposite side. So that's stitched in there through all the layers. I'm going to turn my work around. Do the same over here. Again, back tack at the beginning, back tack at the end. Yeah, I think I stitched a little bit of a gap in there, so I'm going to redo that. Don't like how that came out at all. Some pins would probably be a good idea. This one's gone off. It's been scooted out of place, so I gotta rip the whole stitching line out. just going to catch this little bit near the center first. Just to act as some machine basting, because I feel like my fabric wants to shift around on me. Make sure I didn't get too much of a gap in there. Okay, that's a little bit better. You could hand baste these into place or machine based. I don't like seeing that light coming through there on this side. That's bothering me. But for a sample, I'll take it. I'll go over everything as close as I can get to my garment fabric without actually stitching into it. Back tack at the beginning and at the end. Not great, but I'll take it. I've already restitched it twice. I'm not restitching it a third time. That's what I say. Try it once. If it doesn't work out, try it again. After that, call it a day. As long as you understand the basic steps and principles of it. If it's not perfect, you get it perfect the next time you do one. Okay. So these two sides are stitched down. So we've got the start to our bound buttonhole. I'm going to do the same up here for my smaller buttonhole. As I mentioned before, I'm not going to talk my way through the whole thing, but I'm going to go ahead and do my second bound buttonhole up here. I'm going to use my pattern. I'll just take measurements off of my pattern. check to see how accurate this is. Just kind of poke some pins through it. See if I'm anywhere close. On an actual garment, you would have tailor's tacks that would get copied over onto your fabric from your pattern. What's important is that we mark this in the right place. That's most important. However that needs to get done. Chalk, transfer paper, tailor's tacks, friction pen, whatever you need to do to get this position. I'm going to go sew this on the machine. This 1/4 inch in on either side does not have to be perfect. Sometimes folks will go 1/4 inch in on either side to get the points of those little triangles. Some folks will go 3/8 of an inch in. Go get this pressed into place on the iron. Again, I'll press this down and then back up to get one of the welts. And then I'll press this bottom one up and back down to get the second welt. Make sure I adjust the folds on top and bottom so that they are as horizontal as possible and equal thicknesses all the way across, 1/4 inch wide, and avoid too much gapping between the two. And I'll lock down my two sides. Switch back to a 2. I was like, why is this taking so long? You notice I just back tacked over the entire thing. As long as it reinforces the stitches. But I also started sewing in a number 1 stitch, so I'm sure that will be... It's going to have a hard time wiggling its way out, so that serves as a reinforcing stitch in and of itself. Get the other side done. That's much better. Not so much of a gap in there. The lips are not as even as I'd like them to be, but I'm gonna go with it. So there is my smaller bound buttonhole and the larger bound buttonhole. You can test these to make sure your button will fit through. Should have plenty of space to get through. Now we're not done with this sample yet because this does not look cute on the back. We're going to finish this off with our bound buttonhole left facing pattern. So we're going to install a facing on the back of this. And to do that, I want to clean up some of this excess. We've got a lot of extra fabric dangling out on either side of these buttonholes. So I'm going to trim this off, leaving about 1/2 inch, 3/8 of an inch of extra fabric still attached because I still have my stitching lines there. I'm going to reduce that from either side. Same thing here. Remove some of that excess. And for this smaller one, if you want to trim off some from the top and bottom, you can. Just so we don't have quite as much bulk to deal with. I've got my notches here along the right-hand side of my sample. Going to get my left facing pattern. I've also got corresponding notches at the top and bottom. Align those with right sides together. Pin along this side and stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Back tuck at the beginning and at the end. By trimming our excess buttonhole fabric, we shouldn't catch anything in that seam allowance. Take this to the iron, press it open, and then turn everything. I'll press this open on the iron, and then I will turn my facing pattern to the back of my sample and press it again so it's nice and crisp on this edge. Remember, press it open first. Press your seam allowances open. Then turn your facing around to the opposite side of your sample to clean finish it, and then press it again. There we go. Nice clean finish. If you don't press your seam open first, the seam will not lay directly on that fold properly. To lock this in place, I'm going to top stitch this. I'm going to place my fabric into my machine, aligning the leftmost edge of this foot right along that folded edge, so I know I'm sewing at a 1/16 of an inch. I'm going to back tack at the beginning and at the end. Similar to our turned and stitched seam finish. Practice that needle control so we get that top stitch right up along that edge and keeping it as consistent as possible. All right, we've got our buttonholes installed. I sewed my seam, pressed it open, turned everything right sides out, pressed it again, and then top stitched along this edge. Now, this was working great 2 seconds ago. I could totally get my button in and out, but now I've got this in the way. This is called installing a bound buttonhole with a facing. So a facing cleans off the raw edge of a garment or a garment pattern. So we just attached another piece of fabric which clean finished this raw edge that we once had. So you can imagine this might be the front edge of a jacket or coat or something like that, and this would be the rest of the coat or jacket. And we've just clean finished this edge. But now we gotta cut more holes so we can make room for our buttonholes over here. So again, I'll show you what we're gonna do here, and then I'll repeat it here, I won't be talking my way through the smaller one as much. I'm gonna grab some pins, and now we can work with some friction pens because we're gonna be working on the muslin over here. I'm gonna grab some pins. I'm gonna pin through each corner of my bound buttonhole. So I'm gonna put a pin in this corner, straight down, lifting up the rest of my work. You all have pinnable work surfaces on campus that you can utilize. I'm gonna turn this around, find where that pin is sticking out. Actually, yeah, that's fine. Stick a pin in that corner. Turn my work around and make a little dot for myself so I know where that's coming out, and I'll repeat that on the remaining 3 corners. We want to get as close to that corner as possible. And just to be absolutely sure, I'm going to stick a pin in all 4 corners at once. Make sure my points are somewhat close. This one needs to scoot over. Okay. Pretty happy with the placement of those 4 points. I'm going to remove my pins. And on the facing side of my sample, I'm going to connect the dots. Again, I remember that I have a 1 inch tall by 1 1/8 inch wide rectangle. So I'm going to utilize those measurements. Oh my goodness. I'm nowhere near the camera. So I've connected those 4 dots. I'm going to find the midpoint. I know I've got 1/2 inch tall welts, so I'm just going to find the middle of this. 1/4 inch in on either side. And make my little triangles just like I did on the front. Okay, same shape as I had on the front when I was cutting it out. We've already got interfacing on here, so it's nice and stable. I don't need to sew anything into place. I just need to cut this out. And then I'm going to grab my facing. I'm just picking out my facing only. We've already cut through this. We don't need to cut this anymore. Just grabbing my facing, snipping through that. Now I got a little hole in there. I'm going to cut along those lines just like I did on the front of the buttonhole. And again, I'm going to be very careful not to get too close to those corners. I don't have any stitching in those corners right now, but I don't want this to get too, I don't want this, I'm about to make another window on my facing, and I don't want it to get too big. Okay, So there is my open piece again, and I'm just going to fold these pieces under. Fold each one up and out of the way. Fold my little triangles up and out of the way and make a new little window out of my facing. And I will press this in place, make sure these are tucked out of the way as best I can get them, and press this all in place. Okay. And if I lift this up, you can see there's that seam allowance hanging out under there. And close this, pin this in place so it doesn't go anywhere. I'm going to pin through everything just to make sure it is anchored. And now to keep this facing from flapping away, I'm going to hand stitch this into place. I've gotten some black thread on a needle. We're going to hand stitch the back of these bound buttonholes. I'm choosing black thread just so it's a little bit easier to see on the video, but by all means you can use thread similar to the color of your garment. I'm going to reach inside of my facing. I'm going to find the seam allowance under here, just lift this up a little bit, stick my needle down there through that fold, so it should come out through that fold. That way I can anchor my knot in here and no one would know where it was. And just as we did when we were sewing around the front, I'm going to start on one of the long ends and work my way around so I'm not starting in a corner. Now we can do a slip stitch. We can utilize a slip stitch to sew this together. We can use what's called a ladder stitch. So I'll show you how we go about doing the ladder stitch. It's very much like the basting stitch or running stitch that we learned, except we're going through two sides of fabric. So I just came out through the garment edge here on this folded edge. Now I'm going to go into my buttonhole fabric. I can see where my thread is, where that's left off. I'm going to put my needle down into my contrast fabric, very close to the edge of that fold. You can see there's my needle going through my buttonhole fabric. I've just picked up a little bit of fabric. I'm only going through one layer. I can't see my needle from the opposite side. And I'm taking a small stitch, about 1/8 of an inch. And I'm going to go pull my thread through. I'm using a single length of thread. So now my thread has gone through my buttonhole fabric. I'm going to go back to this fold of my fabric of my garment, put my needle, travel through that fold, similar to how we do with a slip stitch. There it is, needle traveling through that fold. And again, my thread came out here, so I placed my needle here, just beside it. And I'll pull that through. Now again, my thread is kind of coming down in this direction, so I'm going to put my needle down in that direction, close to that fold, through my contrast fabric, through my buttonhole fabric here. There's my needle going through my buttonhole fabric. It has not penetrated to the opposite side. I'll push that through, again, about 1/8 of an inch stitch. So a ladder stitch, you kind of go through one side and then the opposite side and then the other side and then back and forth and back and forth. So I will continue working my way around this little square, try my best to come out near the corners. I want to make sure that my thread isn't coming out down here where my cut is of my hole. I want to come up ever so slightly so I'm actually catching fabric. If you're using a thread similar to the color of your fabric, you won't see these little stitches. And honestly, if anyone is digging around inside of your garment trying to find these little stitches, then that's their own problem. I'm taking a tiny little stitch through my buttonhole fabric. They're going on a diagonal as I go around this corner. There's all manner of stitches that you can use to finish this off. And I'll go back, since I just took a stitch from my buttonhole fabric, I'll go into the fold of my facing fabric here. Back down into this fabric, trying to avoid going over this gap in my buttonhole welts. Back up into here. And I will continue all the way around. To finish off, I'm gonna slide my needle back up into my garment, up through that fold. I'm gonna reach inside, pick up my needle from inside, if I can find it. Just want to make sure I can feel that needle coming out of here, so make sure it's not getting trapped underneath my interfacing. This is probably the hardest part, just kind of reaching inside and grabbing that. And now I can take a couple of small stitches and anchor this thread just about anywhere. I can anchor it into my seam allowance, onto the button fabric, Anywhere is fine. 2 little stitches as that loop comes through, put my needle through that loop, anchor that, and then again I can just take like a quick little stitch just to travel my thread and snip. So now our facing isn't going to come loose from here, from the front of our garment. We have clear passage all the way through our facing, so we can slide our button in once we get our buttons installed. And I will repeat the same for this buttonhole up here. Trying to take some smaller stitches on this one so I can still get my stitches in the right orientation as I go around these corners. Your stitch spacing does not have to be uniform. Do what you need to get into the corners as best you can. This is advanced garment construction. Take your time, be patient with yourself. Try it once. If you don't like how it comes out, try it again. After the second time, call it. Let it be what it's going to be. Move on to the next sample. And then afterwards, if you have time later to try to redo it a third time, then you can do it a third time. All right, I'm gonna reach inside, see if I can find this needle, make sure it's not trapped underneath my interfacing. Place that through the folds. There we go. And just take a few anchoring stitches. As that loop comes through, place my needle through the loop, and then I'll just travel my needle just so the thread has some place to seat itself and leave a bit of a tail. Two bound buttonholes completed. I have got a mess on my table. So this is what it looks like from the right side of the garment. So it will match the orientation of your pattern. And again, your buttons should go right through these buttonholes, no problem. Next, we'll look at the other side where we actually sew our buttonholes on.